All right, let's get started. So let's continue on with Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I wanted to just go over some of the things that I said last time at the end. Remember, just a few things to bear in mind structurally about the novel. The first is that it has this kind of double plot, so it moves both north and south. And again, that's another way of reiterating the fact that slavery is a national problem. It's not simply something that is a southern problem that they need to deal with. In a way, Stowe wants to indicate that the entire country, as Emerson came to realize after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, is implicated in slavery. And I think that's one of the reasons, not only that she creates the double plot, but has the worst villain in the novel, and arguably the worst villain in 19th century American literature, Simon Legree, hail from the North and to be the embodiment of a certain kind of market capitalism that just happens to seize on traffic in human bodies as its object. Another thing that I wanted you to think about structurally was to think about the way in which the idea of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the title of the book, suggests that there's something important about, you might say, domestic situations. This is a domestic novel. And it's a domestic novel that falls into the sentimental tradition, which means it's a novel that is intended, one way to think about what sentimentality does is that it is intended primarily to appeal to the reader's emotions rather than the intellect first. Right? So you might say it's a kind of variation on the old idea that the goal of poetry, you can find this in Samuel Johnson or Samuel Taylor Coleridge, well expressed. The idea is to instruct by pleasing, right? That literature is taken in the 18th century to have a didactic function. But what separates it from other forms of writing is that it pleases the reader first. You enjoy reading it and then realize that you have had some kind of educative experience after you're done. So this is a variant in that in which what Stowe is going to do is she has a kind of analytical point to make. She has an intellectual point to make about the evils of slavery. But the way she's going to make that point first is by getting you in the heartstrings. She's going to grab onto those, pull those, and then finally make her intellectual points. You might say that sentimental fiction is a form that appeals first and foremost to sentiment, to feeling, and secondarily, but very importantly, to intellect after that. And it's linked in the 19th century to the idea of domesticity, so domestic life as the sphere of sentiment, as opposed to the life of the economy or of politics, which are meant to be linked to the life of the intellect or of abstraction, you might say. Remember, she's interested in emotions, in a kind of palpable feeling. That's what she wants to do. She wants to create for her readers something that is like the experience that Senator Byrd has when, having thought about fugitive slaves in caricatures or as abstractions or as, the people you'd read about in court cases, opens his back door and sees a young woman with a young child and then sees that child dressed in his dead son's clothes, has a kind of visceral emotional experience that in the end trumps his intellectual experience. And for Stowe, you'll remember, that is a form of improvement. It's an ameliorative moment when he moves from being simply a senator who thinks in legal abstractions and in laws and about caricatures from the press, to someone who is, in some sense, a man and can feel more fully. So that's one of the other things that we want to say. The house calls up the domestic situation. The domestic situation brings in this whole discourse of sentimentality, but also, therefore, the house becomes one of the central ways in which the novel is organized. So what we are really seeing, and we'll go through this a little bit more detail today, is a kind of series of domestic situations. So we have a kind of opening domestic situation on the Shelby plantation. And that presents us with, in some sense, a kind of separation of spheres. Mr. Shelby is the man who runs the business, apparently not very well, since he's not doing very well, he's having to sell his slaves. His wife is a little bit cowed by him, isn't able really to intervene on behalf of the slaves that she's been trying to raise. We see a variation on that in the Byrd household later on, where Mrs. Byrd is able to slowly but surely exert what Stowe calls influence on her husband. And we talked last time about the way in which the novel seems to accept this separation of spheres into a masculine sphere of economy and business and politics and abstraction and intellect on the one hand, and a domestic feminine sphere that's about education and religion and feeling and sentiment. And one of the things she's proposing is that in the right state of affairs, the domestic sphere should exert a strong influence on the masculine sphere. The novel doesn't seem to propose to us ever that women should up and become politicians and actually literally intervene. Instead, perhaps they should work as Mrs. Bird does. Right? So that is another variation on the Shelby household, and we see a variety of these different variations as the novel progresses. So that's another structuring thing I want you to think about. When a novel does something like this, you might say it works in a kind of factorial way. The sum total of the novel is the product of a number of factors which are in some sense variations on a single idea. This can be in terms of character, can be in terms of settings, scenes like this. You want to think closely about how the novel has created a system of value and then explored this system of value by setting up variations on how these values might be mixed together, right? So as I said, there's a masculine sphere and a feminine sphere. The novel clearly prefers many of the aspects of the feminine sphere, right? But not every woman has the virtues of femininity. It is not enough just to be a woman, in other words. And there are many men in this novel who do have some of the virtues of femininity, right? We see this very clearly in the St. Clair household, where Augustine and his wife Marie seem to have almost switched places. It's almost like she's the man of the household who thinks in these kinds of abstractions, even though she constantly appeals to, like, oh, a mother, if you were a mother, you'd understand. You know, we understand who the real mother in that household is, and it is not Marie. It may be Augustine, but probably more likely it's Mammy, right? So there are interesting things going on in these households in which these elements of masculine and feminine are being reorganized and tested as a result, right? One indication, perhaps, that the feminine sphere alone isn't sufficient is that you might say that part of what brings down the St. Clair household is that Augustine St. Clair lacks a little bit of the kind of masculine, let's do it now. He's not enough of a man of action, and that proves to have kind of tragic results. So again, Stowe is interested in the interplay of these different values. She believes in the separation of spheres, but she believes in a system in which both spheres are necessary. But there needs to be the correct relationship between them. And at the beginning of the novel, that relationship is amiss. There's something wrong with it. Okay? So that's one of the things that we want to say. The third thing to say is that there are sort of three major parts of it. This is kind of the opening part, which focuses primarily, I suppose, on the Harris' story. Then that long second part, which is about the time in New Orleans and the St. Clair household, which I suggested to you last time, is much longer than it really should be if we were going to have a well-proportioned narrative. In terms of what action takes place, in terms of what we need to have to tell a tight story, there shouldn't be that many chapters. But it becomes, you might say, that the time when the novelist seems to warm to her subject, in which she creates some of these indelible characters that people tend to remember, and in which she allows these characters to start to having, become appealing to the reader if everything is working and you're reading according to her plan. She's then able to bring in some of the kind of intellectual discourse that she wants to have. But then there's this third section that happens after the death of St. Clair, the death of Eva and the death of St. Clair, in which we move into one of the darkest phases of slavery. And there's an interesting thing, just to give you an overview, there's an interesting thing that seems to happen at the end of the novel, in which the very premises or sufficiency of sentimentality itself are being questioned. Maybe sentimental isn't enough. Maybe you need other literary technologies. In this case, it turns out to be Gothic. And so Stowe starts to explore what the relation between the sentimental and the Gothic might be. And then we'll see at the end how, you might say, she resolves a potential conflict between these two things. All right. Just to get us back up to speed so we remember where we were last week. Remember that Stowe thinks of writing instrumentally, right? She doesn't mean to be thought of as an artist. She doesn't have those kind of aspirations in the way that somebody like Hawthorne or Melville might have been said to have. She thinks of writing instrumentally at first to earn money, right? She wins $50 in a prize, realizes that she can supplement her family income through writing. That's one thing. It's an extension of her motherly duties, therefore, to help out in that way. And later when she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, she conceives it as a further extension of her maternal duties, right? She writes to the editor of the National Era in 1851, up to this year, I have always felt that I had no particular call to meddle with this subject. And I dreaded to expose even my own mind to the full force of its exciting power. But I feel now that the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. We can no longer sit on the sidelines, right? It's come time. The men, and the inference here that we might have is that men and ministers, all these things that are part of the masculine sphere are letting the country down. Now it's come the time that even women and children have to speak. Right, so that's one thing. Retrospectively, she comes back to think about this later on when she writes a preface to an 1879 edition. And I think I told you later on in her career, when she's very much the woman of letters, she likes to write about herself in the third person. So she says, she was convinced that the presentation of slavery alone in its most dreadful forms would be a picture of such unrelieved horror and darkness as nobody could be induced to look at. Of set purpose, she sought to light up the darkness by humorous and grotesque episodes, and the presentation of the milder and more amusing phases of slavery, for which her recollection of the never-failing wit, that should be wit, and drollery of her former colored friends in Ohio gave her abundant material. And this is exactly the kind of statement that people subsequently find problematic, right? I mean, the idea that there could be any milder and more amusing phases of slavery is something that seems anathema to us now. But you can imagine that one of the things she does to both appeal to the emotions, and it's not only going to be to the tragic emotions, but she's going to try to create things that you can enjoy, is to appeal to certain kinds of essentialist stereotypes that have to do with the way in which African Americans sing or dance, or certain certain kinds of down-home practicality. For example, in Chloe's kitchen or Mammy's kitchen are things that Stowe uses to kind of leaven the story up and make it seem a little bit less oppressive than it might be. And that's one of the things that we should remember about the strategy of the novel, is that in some sense, one of the things that she's doing is suggesting that this is a time when these three oppressed groups, women, children, and slaves, actually can have a voice, need to intervene. But again, the style of the novel goes along with this general idea about influence. They're not going to intervene directly. Bless you. We're not going to write a tract. We're going to write a fiction which can exert a certain kind of influence. And part of the necessary trickery of that fiction is that we're going to have some comic relief. For her, the ready-to-hand comic relief comes in the kind of wit that she finds in African American culture. Again, today that wit puts us off because it's been exaggerated so much in the later part of the 19th century in things like Tom shows and other forms of minstrelsy on stage that we find it kind of off-putting. Right? So I want you to again think about the ways in which Stowe is finding a set of, you might even call them kind of literary tactics that she can deploy. And I would suggest to you that she deploys them rather consciously. Again, I suggested last time that she was deploying these as a part of a mode of activist sentimentality that she learns from Sterne and Dickens, and very much Dickens. Right? I mean, if any of you have read Dickens, either in high school or in the context of a lit course here, you'll remember that Dickens is a social reformer in many ways. And there's some very dark things in Dickens. Just think about child abuse in Hard Times or in Oliver Twist. And yet all of these novels are lightened by kind of moments of comic relief and by comic characters. There's a sense in which Stowe is trying to translate the Dickensian idiom into American letters, and that's part of what her project is. All right. One of the things to bear in mind then is this idea of the lowly. And for her, the lowly means not only Africans who are enslaved in the United States, but also other people who are set aside, women and children. And so these three groups are very much linked together in the novel's imagination. And I want you to understand that they are not incidentally linked together. It's very much, it seems to be by design. The novel creates moments of comparison among these different groups. And we might say it's a dangerous strategy, not just for the depiction of African American culture, right? I mean, not just because we can see in the subsequent career of the novel, for African American intellectuals, this novel became anathema because it seemed to portray as a desirable cultural effect the subservience of African American men and women to some other set of values. But you can see how even in terms of the novel's secondary but still important feminist agenda, this idea of submitting forms possibly a new rationale for the submission of women, right? And we're writing at a time when women still have not achieved equal rights. So you might say for a while this novel became not at all useful for feminist thinkers or people who were interested in promoting women's suffrage or other kinds of feminist causes. And again, it's only later on in the middle of the 1960s really that it starts to be reclaimed as part of a general reclamation of thinking about kinds of writing that don't fit a kind of modernist prototype. Right? So these are all some of the things that I want you to be bearing in mind as we look at a few of the more details. Right? So one of the ways, and to put this in a nutshell, I would suggest to you that this is a novel that is deeply critical of and even sets itself against forms of racial and patriarchal oppression. Okay? I'll say it again. It sets itself deliberately against forms of racial and patriarchal oppression. It does so by tactically making use of a number of stereotypes that we would think of as racist and sexist. Okay, so it's using what today we would call racist and sexist stereotypes. I would call them modes of essentialist thinking. But it's using these essentialist modes, which are typically thought of as in collusion with patriarchal and racial oppression, against patriarchal and racial oppression. So, for example, let's take a look at some examples of this, and you'll see what I mean, I think, very vividly. Take a look on page... Oh, how about page 44? This is an early example of this. The little boy comes in. Mr. Shelby says, "Hello, Jim Crow," whistling and snapping a bunch of raisins towards him. "Pick that up now." The child scampered with all his little strength after the prize while his master laughed. "Come here, Jim Crow," he said. The child came up and the master patted the curly head and chucked him under the chin. "Now, Jim, show this gentleman how you can dance and sing." All right, so that is the master's behavior. This is the narrator. The boy commenced one of those wild, grotesque songs common among the Negroes in a rich, clear voice, accompanying his singing with many comic evolutions of the hands, feet, and whole body, all in perfect time to the music. The boy commenced one of those wild, grotesque songs common among the Negroes. So today we would say, that seems like that has a kind of racist tinge to it. Now what I want you to see is that I don't think this is racist because it is not disapproving of it, is not meaning to use this representation as a rationale for the subjection of anything of African Americans. If anything, it's quite approving of the fact that there's something melodious about their culture, that they have, again, you might imagine it as being all part of the domestic sphere over against a masculine sphere that doesn't have time for things like this. Right? So again, but this is again a moment in which the novel is making use of an essentialist stereotype that African Americans are naturally gifted as singers or have a natural affinity towards music, things like that. Let's find another one. How about page 77? This is singing also. They're getting together to celebrate. Middle paragraph. After a while, the singing commenced to the evident delight of all present. Not even all the disadvantage of nasal intonation could prevent the effect of the naturally fine voices in airs at once wild and spirited. And I take it that means, they're not trained. They still have nasal intonation. They're not tutored in singing. Nevertheless, they have the kind of natural advantage, naturally fine voices. The words were sometimes the well-known and common hymns sung in the churches about, sometimes of a wilder, more indefinite character, picked up at camp meetings. The chorus of one of them, which ran as follows, was sung with great energy and unction. Die on the field of battle, die on the field of battle, glory in thy soul, etc., etc. So it goes on in this kind of mode. See if we go on. Well, we could even go on. There were others which made incessant mention of Jordan's banks, Canaan's fields, and the New Jerusalem. For the Negro mind, impassioned and imaginative, always attaches itself to hymns and expressions of a vivid and pictorial nature, And as they sung, some laughed and some cried and some clapped hands or shook hands rejoicingly with each other as if they had fairly gained the other side of the river, right? And we would say there's something slightly patronizing, perhaps, about that description. But one of the things to say is that the novel, if insofar as the novel is attributing something childlike to the African American temperament or the African American intellect, it thinks that's a good thing. The two most Christ-like characters in the novel, Tom and Ava, both have a kind of childlike appreciation for the world and for other people, right? So the novel is deliberately making a link between Tom and Ava. And in part, it lays the groundwork for that by creating this slightly infantilized idea of what the Negro mind, as it would put it, is all about. Let's see. This becomes explicit, actually, in the next example that I've got for you. Page 135. This is Eliza's escape. This is Eliza's escape. So it's about 12 pages into chapter 8 or so. In this edition, it's the middle of 135. Now, there's no more use in making believe be angry with a Negro than with a child. Both instinctively see the true state of the case, though all attempts to effect the contrary. And Sam was in no wise disheartened by this rebuke, though he assumed an air of doleful gravity and stood with the corners of his mouth lowered in most penitential style. Master quite right, quite. It was ugly on me. There's no disputing that are, and of course Master and Missus wouldn't encourage no such works. I'm sensible that are, but a poor nigger like me is mazed tempted to act ugly sometimes when fellers will cut up such shines as that Master Haley. He ain't no gentleman no way. Anybody's been raised as I have been can't help a seeing that, right? So there's a deliberate infantilization, deliberate bringing together of these two forms of representation. And you can go on and on, right? The page 253 in this. I'll put some notes afterwards. The African Americans are described as exotic. A little bit later on, cooking is described as an indigenous talent of the African race, right? So what I want you to see is that the kind of racist and sexist stereotypes are pretty much identical in the novel, or they're clearly mapped onto one another. And the masculine characteristics of white male characters are often and almost consistently contrasted with the feminine qualities not only of white women, but also of black men. Let's take a look in chapter 10. This is page 162. I think it's probably the third paragraph of chapter 10. Well, let's start with the second. Tom sat by with his Testament open on his knee and his head leaning upon his hand, but neither spoke. It was yet early, and the children lay all asleep together in their little rude trundle bed. Tom, who had to the full the gentle domestic heart, which, woe for them, has been a peculiar characteristic of his unhappy race, got up and walked silently to look at his children. It's the last time, he said. Now again, this is a moment when we see this kind of mixture of things. There's, again, you're going to say there's something patronizing about this. The peculiar characteristic of his unhappy race, right? It's written from a seeming vantage point of white narrative superiority, and yet this is a moment of deep pathos in which the narrative has profound sympathy for Tom and the plight that he has. Right? So again, I want you to see how this is working. These are passages that are designed to create sympathy for Tom. And you might say, insofar as Ava and Tom are set up to be kind of Christ-like figures, the function that Ava plays in the novel is, in fact, not only Christ-like, but in a certain sense, she plays the role of John the Baptist. We cathect, really, onto her. We invest her. We have a lot of our emotions as readers get focused on her. And when she dies, they focus someplace else. And it's almost as if we've been taught now to have them focus on Tom. And there's a sense in which his death replays her death, lives up even to the promise of selflessness that her death implies. And in some sense, the novel helps us to appreciate Tom by first finding someone with whom we more readily appreciate, a young, innocent girl who's all dressed in white, Shouldn't have that red. She's almost always dressed in white, as opposed to Pearl, who you'll meet in, like, next week, who's almost always dressed in red. They make an interesting contrast. Please don't write a paper about that. Please. But there's a sense in which part of Ava's function is to prepare us for Tom. She sucks us in by getting us used to thinking about Ava, and then we transfer many of those same emotions onto Tom. There is a slave who defies the stereotypes that I've just been talking about. Anybody think of an example? Yeah. George Harris, right. So George Harris would seem to be an exception to this rule. Except, why is it that George is different? Remember anything about George that makes him particularly interesting or different from Tom? Yeah?
Well, he was educated and he was in factory away from the
Okay.
film for a long time.
And
He was written as incredibly smart.
okay, and there's something else about him too. His genes. Right, he's mulatto. Take a look at page 182 in the chapter that's called An Improper State of Mind. It's about 10 pages into chapter 11. This is at the bottom of 182. We remark en passant that George was, by his father's side, of white descent. His mother was one of those unfortunates of her race, marked out by personal beauty to be the slave of the passions of her possessor, and the mother of children who may never know a father. From one of the proudest families in Kentucky, he had inherited a set of fine European features and a high, indomitable spirit. From his mother, he had received only a slight mulatto tinge, amply compensated by its accompanying rich dark eye. A slight change in the tint of the skin and the color of his hair had metamorphosed him into the Spanish-looking fellow he had then appeared. And as gracefulness of movement and gentlemanly manners had always been perfectly natural to him, he found no difficulty in playing the bold part he had adopted, that of a gentleman traveling with his domestic. All right? So I want you to see here how he's, in some sense, the exception who proves the rule. He's inherited not only European features from his white father, but that kind of high, indomitable spirit. Okay? I want you to think about that. And think about whether it is that that George Harris is, in some sense, the hero of the novel, or whether, in fact, it is a kind of very mixed blessing to have inherited these things, right? Part of what we realize in the novel is that the novel at the end cannot imagine a place for the Harrises in the United States, and they are, in some sense, relegated off to Liberia. Part of it is this kind of weird mixture of George. One of the things that George is not the natural, George is in some sense not the natural Christian that Tom is, and that works against him in the imagination of the novel. Let's take a look at one of these other households that we haven't had much of a chance to talk about yet. This is the Quaker settlement, and it's in chapter, it's chapter 13, which is 214 in this edition. This is an illustration of characters from the Quaker settlements. And again, that's Eliza, right? So we're meant to understand that Eliza also is very fair. Now, let's take a look at page 222 here. There's an interesting passage here for us to look at. Bottom of the page. This is about, again, 12 pages into the chapter, maybe. It comes after a break. The paragraph begins, "The next morning was a cheerful one at the Quaker house." A little bit further on. "While therefore John ran to the spring for fresh water, and Simeon the second sifted meal for corn cakes, and Mary ground coffee, Rachel Halliday, moved gently and quietly about, making biscuits, cutting up chicken, and diffusing a sort of sunny radiance over the whole proceeding generally. If there was any danger of friction or collision from the ill-regulated zeal of so many young operators, her gentle 'come, come,' or 'I wouldn't now,' was quite sufficient to allay the difficulty. Bards have written of the cestus of Venus that turned the heads of all the world in successive generations. We had rather, for our part, have the cestus of Rachel Halliday, that kept heads from being turned and made everything go on harmoniously. We think it is more suited to our modern days, decidedly." right? So she has a kind of matriarchal authority. It seems to work effortlessly, but does it work through direct punishment? Not exactly. It works through something that's much more like influence. Come, come, she says, or I wouldn't now, right? Gently. Just kind of, it sounds like she's just kind of keeping order on a kind of a system that's chaotic or entropic of all these particles. She keeps them from colliding with one another. Interestingly, her authority never seems to be challenged by the Quaker men in the settlement. Next paragraph. While all other preparations were going on, Simeon the elder stood in his shirt sleeves before a little looking glass in the corner, engaged in the anti-patriarchal operation of shaving. Why is that anti-patriarchal? Is that a joke? What? Yeah. Yeah, and just think about Old Testament patriarchs too. Long beards, right? So if you shave, it's being anti-patriarchal. That's kind of a joke, right? But it's one of the things that signals that the whole idea of what constitutes a patriarch and who usually runs settlements like this is on the novel's mind. Just through that little grace note, if you will. Everything went on sociably, so quietly, so harmoniously in the great kitchen. It seemed so pleasant to everyone to do just what they were doing. There was such an atmosphere of mutual confidence and good fellowship everywhere. Even the knives and forks had a social clatter as they went on to the table. And the chicken and ham had a cheerful and joyous fizzle in the pan, as if they rather enjoyed being cooked than otherwise. Seems like a little one of those kind of like Warner Brothers cartoons, right? I mean, it's something happy about it. It's just about as unrealistic as a cartoon as well. Or you might say, for the novel's imagination, it understands this as a kind of utopian space. It's not really generally possible, and it isn't possible for the Harrises to stay here for very long. And when George and Eliza and little Harry came out, they met such a hearty, rejoicing welcome. No wonder it seemed to them like a dream. And as far as they are concerned, it is a dream, right? So one of the things to say within the topographical imagination of the novel is that to move north away from Ohio and Kentucky, to move north towards Canada, is to move towards freedom. That's one thing that we would say is going on. There's also a hint that's also doing something else. It's to move from the public world of a plantation or a senator's house to something more private, a kind of settlement, and a matriarchal settlement. So to move from a world of power, say, of the senator in the senator's household, to a world where power is exerted differently here through feminine influence. And one of the things we might say is that the ultimate result for George Harris of this move northward is the increasing influence of this feminine influence on him. So at the end, something about that high indomitable spirit of his leads him to be tempered a little bit. And we'll take a look at that again. Okay? So that's the movement north. The movement south is a little bit different, and it's a little bit strange as well. New Orleans house of Augustine and Marie St. Clair is, as I suggested already, a kind of strange variation on the opening domestic situation. In fact, it's probably the most unusual one because the masculine and feminine seem split up in interesting and different ways. Let's see, I think I have a... Now, one of the things to notice about this is that it is a courtyard in the Moorish style, right? So one of the things that we would say is it's kind of elaborate. It's even Baroque. There's something voluptuous about it. These are words that Stowe uses. And one of the things to suggest about that is that it is in some sense a kind of reflection of St. Clair's personality to have this kind of household, of house. Right? I want you to remember this, though, this image. We'll come back to it. It's got the courtyard. It's got fountains inside. It's got this enclosed garden space. Got these arches here, and this kind of terraces on the top. Okay, that's the way it looks. We'll see another house a little bit later on that's a variation on that particular situation. Now, inside the house, we have Marie and Augustine. And as I suggested to you, there's a funny way in which, when the values were poured into each of them, they didn't get poured in exactly the way we would accept. Marie is kind of selfish and masculine. And Augustine has a lot. Where does his greatest influence comes not from his father, he says, but from his mother, he tells us. Let's take a look at the chapter that's called Tom's Mistress and Her Opinions. This is, let's take a look on page 277 of this edition, and that is, I don't know, about 17 or 18 pages into chapter 16. Right? Again, think about how I've mapped things out, right? Where does religion belong in going to church? Which sphere does those belong to? Marie kind of knows what the values of the feminine sphere are supposed to be. She knows what she's supposed to be. She just, in some sense, chooses not to do it, or rather, she chooses to manipulate those values to generate sentiment or sympathy for herself, right? As opposed to someone earlier, even Emily Shelby and certainly Mrs. Bird, these are values in which they seem sincerely to live. Marie seems to have a kind of relation of bad faith to some of these values. So, top of the page. Ava looked downcast and aggrieved and turned slowly. I say, Marie, let the child alone. She shall do as she pleases, said St. Clair. St. Clair, how will she ever get along in the world, said Marie. The Lord knows, said St. Clair, but she'll get along in heaven better than you or I. Oh, Papa, don't, said Eva, softly touching his elbow. It troubles Mother. Well, cousin, are you ready to go to the meeting? Said Miss Ophelia, turning square about on St. Clair. I'm not going, thank you. I do wish St. Clair ever would go to church, said Marie, but he hasn't a particle of religion about him. It really isn't respectable. I know it, said St. Clair. You ladies go to church to learn how to get along in the world, I suppose, and your piety sheds respectability on us. If I did go at all, I would go where Mammy goes. There's something to keep a fellow awake there at least. What? Those shouting Methodists? Horrible, said Marie. Anything but the Dead Sea of your respectable churches, Marie. Positively, it's too much to ask of a man. Ava, do you like to go? Come stay at home and play with me. Thank you, Papa, but I'd rather go to church. Isn't it dreadful tiresome, said St. Clair. I think it is tiresome some, said Ava. And I'm sleepy too, but I try to keep awake, right out of the mouths of babes. What do you go for then? Why, you know, Papa, she said in a whisper. Cousin told me that God wants to have us, and he gives us everything, you know. And it isn't much to do it if he wants us to. It isn't so very tiresome at all. You sweet little obliging soul, said St. Clair, kissing her. Go along, that's a good girl, and pray for me. Certainly, I always do, said the child as she sprang after her mother into the carriage. Right? So there's a whole set of things that are being laid out here, a whole discourse of respectability. And that's part of the discourse that Stowe is taking aim at. She hates this idea of Christian respectability. All these women like Marie who go to church and listen to ministers and do nothing, at best, about slavery, and at worst, are actually promulgators of slavery in the way that Marie turns out to be. Right? So there's one thing. There's the idea that there's a more authentic form of Christianity that is available here. It isn't the church that Marie goes to, it's the one that Mammy goes to. And immediately you see here, as in elsewhere in this section, a kind of comparison and contrast set up between Marie and Mammy. Who's the real mothering figure in this household? Well, there's actually several, and they learn from Mammy. Mammy will be one of them. St. Clair might be another, and little Eva herself might be a kind of mothering figure by the time we're done. Let's take a look a little bit earlier on to get a contrast between Marie and St. Clair. Let's see. Or actually, no, just so let's press a little bit further on this idea of Christian respectability. This is page 208 in Incident of Lawful Trade. And it's a moment that should remind us of the way in which, this should remind us of the way that that Stowe upbraids the South for their attitudes in the moment that she props up Senator Byrd. This is 208 in the chapter called Incident of Lawful Trade, about 16 pages in or so. The trader had arrived at that stage of Christian and political perfection which has been recommended by some preachers and politicians of the North lately, in which he had completely overcome every humane weakness and prejudice. His heart was exactly where yours, sir, and mine could be brought with proper effort and cultivation, right? So this is the effect of respectability. This is the effect of civilization. We have the kind of Christian that this trader conceives himself to be. The wild look of anguish and utter despair that the woman cast on him might have disturbed one less practiced, but he was used to it. He had seen that same look hundreds of times. And then she addresses the reader. You can get used to such things too, my friend. And it is the great object of our recent efforts to make our whole northern community used to them. for the glory of the Union, right? So she takes a dig again at the Fugitive Slave Law. And this is an example then, again, about what the purpose of the novel is. People like Marie, people like this traitor have become the dominant representatives of respectable Christianity. We need something else other than that. Okay, so that's one thing to bear in mind. Let's go back now to take a look at Marie one more time. This is on page 268. Again, I want to, again, there's a set of contrasts that the novel is taking up, right? So that's the form of respectable Christianity. And there's different forms of motherhood. There's kind of respectable motherhood, I suppose, in the way that Marie practices it. And there's real motherhood. On 268, this is in the chapter that's called Tom's Mistress, about 8 pages into it. "Don't you believe that the Lord made them of one blood with us?" said Miss Ophelia shortly. "No, indeed, not I. Pretty story, truly. They are a degraded race. Don't you think they've got immortal souls?" said Miss Ophelia with increasing indignation. "Oh, well," said Marie, yawning, "that, of course. Nobody doubts that. But just putting them on any sort of equality with us, as if we really could be compared, why, it's impossible. Now, St. Clair really has talked to me as if keeping Mammy from her husband was like keeping me from mine. There's no comparing in this way. Mammy couldn't have the feelings that I should. It's a different thing altogether. Of course it is. And yet St. Clair pretends not to see it. Right? So that's one of the things. Again, that's a moment of irony in which we, the reader, clearly see it. And St. Clair is not exactly pretending not to see it, but there's a sense in which you might say that what St. Clair is attempting to do is operate in the way that somebody in the feminine sphere might do, through influence. And we might say that that perhaps isn't quite good enough. All right, let's talk about one of the more disturbing representations of childhood and femininity, and that's Topsy. Topsy, of all the characters in the novel, is most likely to offend people as a kind of racist representation, right? And there's clearly, insofar as the novel is all about setting up contrasts, there's clearly a contrast that's set up between Topsy and little Ava. Topsy is really dark, and little Ava is really white. And little Ava is really well behaved, and Topsy is really not. Okay. Let's take a look in chapter 20. This is page 364 in the Penguin. We'll see how Miss Ophelia, who takes up the care of Topsy, decides. Now, Miss Ophelia is a woman from the north, right? She's a reformer. She comes in with systems, right? There's that funny moment when she tries to make Dinah's kitchen systematic, and of course, it's disastrous. Top of 364. "It's your system makes such children," said Miss Ophelia. "I know it, but they are made. They exist. What is to be done with them?" "Well, I can't say I thank you for the experiment. But then, as it appears to be a duty, I shall persevere and try and do the best I can," said Miss Ophelia. And Miss Ophelia, after this hour, did labor with a commendable degree of zeal and energy on her new subject. She instituted regular hours and employments for her and undertook to teach her to read and sew. Now, Topsy has her preferences. She's not just some wild child, and these are the preferences. In the former art, reading, the child was quick enough. She learned her letters as if by magic and was very soon able to read plain reading. She's a little natural Frederick Douglass, right? But the sewing was a more difficult matter. The creature was as lithe as a cat and as active as a monkey, and the confinement of sewing was her abomination. So she broke her needles, threw them slyly out the window, down in chinks of the walls. She tangled, broke, dirtied her thread, or with a sly movement would throw away a spool altogether. Her motions were almost as quick as that of a practiced conjurer, and her command of her face quite as great. And though Miss Ophelia could not help feeling that so many accidents could not possibly happen in succession, yet she could not, without a watchfulness which would have leave her no time for anything else, detect her. What's going on there in that passage? What are Topsy's preferences all about? What does she like? Reading. With what is that associated? Men, the masculine sphere, getting out of slavery from Frederick Douglass. What doesn't she like? Sewing, right? What is sewing associated with? Women's work, right? Topsy is a little rebel, and there's a funny way in which she's behaving according to a set of principles. So I want to suggest to you that even here, Stowe is reinforcing her method, right? Topsy becomes a prime example of the ways in which some of these values of masculine and feminine can be interestingly blended. And there are certain kinds of relegation of women to certain kinds of work, such as sewing, that it's another way of saying that there's a tie here between slavery and what Stowe refers to as domestic slavery. Right? Now, a very interesting thing happens with Topsy and Miss Ophelia. I asked you to think about this. So the irony, of course, about Miss Ophelia is a couple of things. She walks into the St. Clair household, and immediately she sees Ava kissing Mammy, and she's like, ugh. Well, your young Southern girls do something I couldn't possibly do, right? So clearly Miss Ophelia is a racist. She's a Northern anti-slavery, abolitionist, reformer racist. Okay. So what does Miss Ophelia need to learn to do? She needs to get beyond that category of race or that thing that puts her off. She needs to be able to touch and embrace. She needs the magic of the real presence of distress, right? And she is transformed by the death of little Ava. It becomes a transformative thing. She manages to embrace Topsy and to be a real mother to Topsy, right? That's the story. Except it's not quite that simple. There's one step that needs to be taken between doing that and being able to be Miss Ophelia, being a kind of a real mothering figure for Topsy, and where she was before. And it's a legal step. So what is it? What does she have to do? What does she have to do? Yeah?
She has become a slave owner for Topsy.
Very good. She has to own Topsy. Right? So the white Northern abolitionist lady who reads all the good things, Pilgrim's Progress, Milton, all this kind of stuff is on her bookshelf. She has to gain possession. She tells St. Clair, I want to do it. We need to do it. He's like, all right, we'll do it. And no, we'll do it now. Right? She has enough of that kind of masculinity in her. She said, well, do it now. Would that he had done it now for all of his slaves. But Topsy is saved from the dissolution of the household because Miss Ophelia has to become the thing that is anathema to her. She becomes a slave owner in order that she can gain possession of Topsy and free Topsy. So she works within the system, but that becomes the irony. Again, Northerners, if they want to make a change, have to admit that they are implicated in slavery. They have to own up to it, literally. And then they can actually do some good. Right? So that's not accidental. Again, it's part of a very complicated way in which the narrative is set up to implicate both Southerners and Northerners. And again, the most famous Northern implication is Simon Legree, a Northerner, an ardent capitalist who cares more than anything else about making money. There's a way in which Legree hasn't quite internalized the anti-black racism that seems to motivate many of the characters, but he's happy to use it as a kind of tool. Let's turn to chapter 31 now. This is the last part of the novel. It's page 480 in the Penguin. This is a part of the novel that portrays slavery at its most corrosive. It's called the Middle Passage, and it's designed to, in some sense, suggest that Tom's final passage to Legree's plantation is a recapitulation of the horrible middle passage from Africa to the New World that captured Africans were forced to endure, many of them dying on the way. Packed like sardines into these ships. Influence may not be enough in this section of the novel, right? These are the first 3 paragraphs of chapter 31. On the lower part of a small, mean boat on the Red River, Tom sat, chains on his wrists, chains on his feet, and a weight heavier than chains lay on his heart. All had faded from his sky, moon and star, all had passed by him as the trees and banks were now passing to return no more. Kentucky home, with wife and children and indulgent owners. St. Clair home of Ava with saint-like eyes, the proud, gay, handsome, seemingly careless, yet ever kind St. Clair. Hours of ease and indulgent leisure, the novel has been recapitulated for us, all gone. And in place thereof, what remains? Now the narrator steps back. Impersonal construction. It is one of these bitterest apportionments of lot of slavery, and again we're going to have one of these essentialist summing up moments, that the Negro, sympathetic and assimilative, after acquiring in a refined family the tastes and feelings which form the atmosphere of such a place, is not the less liable to become the bond slave of the coarsest and most brutal. Just as a chair or table which once decorated the superb saloon comes at last battered and defaced to the bar room of some filthy tavern or some low haunt of vulgar debauchery. And again, I want you to see how this works, right? It seems to be patronizing, but it's making the same point, you might say, that Phyllis Wheatley makes in that poem on being brought from Africa to America. She even uses the same word, refined. The African American is sympathetic and assimilative. These are good things, right? They are clearly educable. They naturally take to these kinds of refinements. But the logic of possessive individualism is such that if you aren't free, you're no better than a chair or a table and subject to all of the kind of vicissitudes that property is subject to. The great difference is that the chair and table cannot feel and the man can, right? So I want you to see how that category now, established earlier on in the chapter with Senator Byrd, is being redeployed here. A man can feel. For even a legal enactment that he shall be taken, reputed, adjudged in law to be a chattel personal, cannot blot out his soul with its own private little world of memories, hopes, fears, loves, and desires, right? So clearly there's a kind of natural law that's being, in some sense, contradicted by the laws of the land. Mr. Simon Legree, Tom's master, had purchased slaves at one place and another in New Orleans to the number of 8, and driven them handcuffed in couples of 2 and 2 down to the good steamer Pirate, which lay at the levee ready for a trip up the Red River. Okay, no accident that it's called the Red River. No accident that the ship is called the Pirate, the steamer is called the Pirate, right? Probably it's an actual reference to the moment in Douglas's narrative where he thinks about the right of his owner to own him and take any of his wages as simply the right of the pirate on the high seas to take by force. Right? Let's go about 7 pages on to a description of the landscape in actually it's the beginning of the next chapter called Dark Places. They're now off the river and onto the landscape. It was a wild, forsaken road now winding through dreary pine barrens where the wind whispered mournfully, now over long causeways through song cypress swamps, the doleful trees rising out of the slimy, spongy ground, hung with long wreaths of funeral black moss, while ever and anon the loathsome form of the moccasin snake might be seen sliding among broken stumps and shattered branches that lay here and there, rotting to the water. The approach to Legree's plantation, in other words, which is buried deep in these kind of eerie Louisiana swampy wilderness, draws on Gothic conventions. I mean, this is kind of a mild version of that disgusting passage that I read you from Monk Lewis, right? Think about it. It's a kind of dream landscape, a closed world that's separated from the world of the everyday, somehow cut off. Repeated images of darkness and death, decay, a kind of sense of evil portrays this whole thing. And then we get to the let's see, that's Dark Passages. Let's take a look at Legree's Plantation. Okay, Legree's Plantation is an interesting thing. It seems to embody decay itself. Take a look at page 491. Actually, bottom of 490. So this is about three and some pages into this chapter. Legree had been drinking to that degree that he was inclining to be very gracious. And it was about this time that the enclosures of the plantation rose to view. The estate had formerly belonged to a gentleman of opulence and taste. We've seen a gentleman of opulence and taste, right? Augustine St. Clair. The estate had formerly belonged to a gentleman of opulence and taste who had bestowed some considerable attention to the adornment of his grounds. Having died insolvent, it had been purchased at a bargain by Legree, who used it, as he did everything else, merely as an implement for money-making. The place had that ragged, forlorn appearance which is always produced by the evidence that the care of a former owner has been left to go to utter decay, right? It's decay embodied. What was once a smooth-shaven lawn before the house, dotted here and there with ornamental shrubs, was now covered with frowsy tangled grass, with horse posts set up here and there in it, where the turf was stamped away and the ground littered with broken pails, cobs of corn, and other slovenly remains. Here and there a mildewed jessamine or honeysuckle hung raggedly from some ornamental support, which had been pushed to one side by being used as a horse post. What once was a large garden was now all grown over with weeds, through which here and there some solitary exotic reared its forsaken head. What had been a conservatory had now no window shades, and on the moldering shelves stood some dry, forsaken flower pots with sticks in them, whose dried leaves showed that they had once been plants. Now, Stowe is drawing here again on the withered garden, right? It goes back all the way to Puritan rhetoric, the idea that the New World had been a wilderness. It had then become a garden, but then through spiritual neglect and decay, it's become this horrible wilderness again, right? That whole period of the Jeremiad is in fact being evoked by this. And the topographical imagination of the novel continues to think about the ways in which houses might be expressive of some kinds of larger spiritual states. In that sense, you might say, this is a Gothic landscape. It seems to express the interior decay of Legree himself. Skip a paragraph. The house had been large and handsome. It was built in a manner common at the south, a wide veranda of 2 stories running around every part of the house into which each outer door opened, the lower tier supported by brick pillars. But the place looked desolate and uncomfortable. Some windows stopped up with boards, some with shattered panes, and shutters hanging by a single hinge, all telling of coarse neglect and discomfort. Now I want you to think about this. It's built in a manner common in the south. It's a wide veranda of 2 stories running around every part of the house into which the outer door opened, right? So you can see the veranda out there. Does that remind you of anything else? I should have put the slides right next to it. But to me, it seems like a deliberate inversion of this house, which is also 2 stories, owned by a person who has a kind of rich sensibility, has a Baroque, well-cared-for garden on the inside. Legree's house has the veranda on the 2nd floor going around on the outside. And I don't think that little detail is, in fact, incidental. I think what these 2 houses compared to one another are meant to suggest what happens to something like the St. Clair mansion when it's not run by somebody like St. Clair. It too easily forms the kind of decay. It becomes something that is an embodiment of the worst phases of slavery like that. So you could see in them a kind of progression. We move from one place that seems pretty good to another place that's awful. And yet, I think the novel is suggesting even more than that, by having this kind of inversion, you might say. It's as if this is the St. Clair household turned inside out. And when you turn the St. Clair household inside out, you not only get the verandas and garden on the outside, but what you get is what was at the dark heart of the St. Clair household all along, right? You turn it out, and it's a slaveholder's house, right? One of the things you might say is that Legree, it's almost in a sense then that St. Clair and Legree's plantations function as almost like type and antitype. St. Clair's is the type. The fulfillment of it, the true meaning of it, is not understood until we get to Legree's plantation. And we realize these are both slaveholding plantations, households. And it looked kind of nice because St. Clair seemed like a kind of good guy. But he was irresponsible in a certain way, and his actions or lack of actions have led to Tom's being relocated from the one to the other. But I want to think the novel is creating a certain kind of equivalence. It's only a hop, skip, and a jump, and an accidental stabbing perhaps, to go from one phase of slavery to another. And the overarching point is that they are both phases of slavery. Right? So I think that Stowe is very careful in the way that she describes this house and the way in which she puts these things together. Let's take a look on page 512, a little bit further on. Cassie tells Tom about precisely how isolated he is. This is in the Quadroon story. Right? And Cassie and Tom are having this kind of interaction together, and she tells them about how bad things really are. "You see," said the woman, "you don't know anything." Let's see. Here's Cassie talking to Tom. "I do. I've been on this place 5 years, body and soul, under this man's foot, and I hate him as I do the devil. Here you are on a lone plantation, 10 miles from any other, in the swamps. Not a white person here who could testify," again invoking the conditions of the Fugitive Slave Law, "if you were burned alive, if you were scalded, cut into pieces, set up for the dogs to tear, or hung up and whipped to death. There's no law here of God or man that can do you or any one of us the least good. And this man, there's no earthly thing that he's too good to do. I could make anyone's hair rise and their teeth chatter if I could only tell what I've been seen and known to hear." And so she resolves to kill Legree. And Tom talks her out of it, right? This is part of what he's learned from little Eva. So she does something else. What does she do? She mobilizes one phase of the Gothic, right? She mobilizes that kind of hoax Gothic that we saw we've talked about it in terms of Anne Radcliffe, that we saw in Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, right? So just as Brom Bones impersonates Ichabod Crane, impersonates the Headless Horseman in order to drive Ichabod Crane off, Cassie impersonates a ghost as well, somebody out of, in this term, Legree's past, in order to frighten Legree and enable her own escape. And one of the things I want to suggest to you is that Stowe is deliberately making use of that tradition of Gothic fiction. She's not interested in she's not interested in the kind of charnel house, disgusting Gothic of Lewis and Walpole and all these other writers, or rather she sees that that's what slavery is about. So again, you might say Stowe is manipulating literary forms. She's suggesting that slavery is embodied by that kind of Gothic fiction. She takes another kind of Gothic fiction, the hoax kind of Gothic fiction, and turns it against that other kind, right? And enables, therefore, you might say, to have Gothic fiction become compatible with sentimentality. Finally, so then we get that, right? Cassie haunting Legree. And one of the things to notice about the way in which this works is that it isn't quite so clean, right? I mean, think about how it works psychologically. Tom is carrying around a relic, a kind of talisman, right? Do you remember what it is that he's carrying around? Something that he received? What's that? And what else? A lock of Ava's hair, right? This beautiful gold hair. And when he sees it, Legree has this kind of freak out moment, right? For one thing, it reminds him of the moment when he received a lock of hair from his mother, whom he clearly, who was a Christian woman, whom he clearly didn't treat very well and whom he deeply disappointed. And he's racked by a certain kind of guilt. So that in this context, you might say, in the very deepest form of context, something weird happens to the idea of influence. It isn't so much that the outward forces change, but it's the way in which they are able to perceive changes. So that even saintly little Eva's lock of hair becomes this kind of weird, sinister thing in Legree's imagination, right? He imagines it kind of curling around his finger as if it's alive. You might say that is a sign that he is beyond redemption. He can't actually be saved. Right? And so that's one of the things that, one of the reasons that Stowe brings the Gothic into the sentimental fiction at all is to suggest the limits of sentimentality and also the limits perhaps even of Christian sensibility. There are some people who are going to go to hell. There are some people who cannot be saved. And perhaps what the novel suggests is that we need to concentrate on saving those who can be saved and not worry about those like Legree. We get to the final moment of the novel, the one that you might say is the final building block that Stowe needs before writing the novel, right? Remember I told you she has this vision at the communion table after her son has died of a slave being whipped to death by his master and forgiving that master with his dying breath. And that's what we see. Although again, mostly the very worst part of it occurs off stage. Again, Stowe is not really interested in dramatizing that for us. We only see sometimes the aftermath of Tom's fatal final beating. But here's the funny thing. Okay, so we don't need to belabor that. And I take it all of you are too hard-boiled, nobody will shed a tear, something like that. Sad. But think about this from a narrative point of view. That should be the climax of the novel, right? But it isn't the climax of the novel. Why is that? Possibly, it's to suggest that if Tom is a kind of Christ figure, we can't culminate in his death. We need to see what you might say is the most important thing about the life of Christ and the life of Tom, the after effects that it has. And what are the after effects that we have here? Cassie is saved. Cassie does not become a murderess. Cassie is saved, right? Tom presumably goes to heaven or is within the imagination of the novel. He also acts as a kind of force for redemption. Even the other slaves who are complicit in his death are kind of awed by his behavior. But the final thing that we see is that at the end of the novel, he emerges almost as a kind of symbol. I mean, there's a kind of weird resurrection of Tom at the end when young George Shelby manages to return. And we find out that all this stuff has been going on in the backstory. We kind of come around full circle. We come around back to Uncle Tom's cabin once again. And we see that the cabin is in some sense set up as it's almost like the first domestic situation we want to think about from the beginning of the novel is Uncle Tom's Cabin. It becomes a kind of symbol at the end. And there's a kind of deus ex machina that takes place here, right? So this is where we would say, oh, like sentimental fiction, all of this is truly unbelievable. How could all these people have been related? That's part of the sentimentality. That's part of what puts audiences today off, I suppose. It says that it all gets tied up neatly. But one of the things that Stowe would answer if she was a novelist behind this is she would say, there's a reason that all of these ostensible coincidences come to pass at the end. There's a reason that there seems to have been a kind of controlling force in the background, happening with the Shelbys, even though we don't know about it. What's the name that we would give to this? The name that we might give to this is Providence, right? I mean, ultimately, I want you to see that Stowe would say that there isn't a such thing as coincidence within sentimental fiction. There's a sense in which all of this is part of a kind of larger Christian plan. And so finally, where Stowe ends up here in her concluding remarks section is in some sense to break the fiction entirely. The last image that we have in the chapter that's called The Liberators, that's the second to last chapter, is this image of, let me see if I have it for you, Uncle Tom's cabin. Right? George is able to re-invoke Uncle Tom, now just a kind of ghostly spiritual presence. It was on his grave, my friends, that I resolved before God that I would never own another slave while it was possible to free him. And nobody, through me, should ever run the risk of being parted from home and friends and dying on a lonely plantation as he died. So when you rejoice in your freedom, think that you owe it to that good old soul and pay it back in kindness to his wife and children. Think of your freedom every time you see Uncle Tom's cabin, and let it be a memorial to put you all in mind to follow in his steps and be honest and faithful and Christian as he was, right? And that is the form that Tom's resurrection, you might say, takes place. And that's one of the things that we realize at the end is that we've been reading this very long novel that we thought was a kind of fiction. And in the end, it may be a fiction, but it also takes the form of something else, a sermon. And so Stowe, in some sense, breaks the frame of the fiction at the very end and goes, and it's like all those little bits and pieces of direct address to the reader come front and center at the end, and we find out who the audience for this really is, right? So, page 621, it's about 5 pages into the conclusion. She writes about herself in the third person. No longer as a kind of, now the narrative voice takes on the voice of the author. The author hopes she has done justice to that nobility, generosity, and humanity which in many cases characterize individuals at the South. Such instances save us from utter despair of our kind, but she asks any person who knows the world, are such characters common anywhere? For many years of her life, the author avoided reading or punt allusion to the subject of slavery, considering it too painful to be inquired to, right? That's like that thing that I showed you from the 1879 preface. And she goes on, as the concluding remarks continue, to basically offer up her final suggestion of what people can do. And as I told you last time, if you're expecting some kind of legislative program, some alternative to the Fugitive Slave Law, you're going to be disappointed. Bottom of 624. She has addressed herself now to the mothers and daughters of the free states. But she asks at the bottom of 624, what can any individual do? Of that, every individual can judge. There is one thing that every individual can do. They can see to it that they feel right. And I want you to think about a pun that might be implicit in those worlds. It isn't quite grammatical, but I think it's a pun nonetheless. An atmosphere of sympathetic influence encircles every human being, and the man or woman who feels strongly, healthily, and justly on the great interests of humanity is a constant benefactor to the human race. At the end, what this novel is promoting is a kind of grassroots movement linked to Christianity, linked to the idea of feeling, and then feeling correctly, and then feeling that you are right. And it has tried to teach you how to feel properly, to create that sense of understanding things not in terms of abstractions, but in palpable realities. It's taught you how to respond to narrative, not primarily first through the head, but through the emotions. And in the end, the novel is suggesting that if you take that approach to reading and to life as a whole, you will in the end find that you feel right, that you are in the right. And if everyone did this, it would be a radically different country. Okay, we'll leave it there. As you go on to Hawthorne, I want you to think about the differences between Hawthorne's technique and Stowe's. How does Hawthorne seem to make use of allegory while demonstrating its limitations?